The young widow asked to cook for the rich rancher, until his daughter said, "Can she tuck me in too?" The evening sun poured a golden haze over the vast ranch, the land rolling endlessly into the horizon, a symbol of wealth and hard labor. Dust swirled softly in the air as the young widow stepped through the wrought iron gate, her shoes worn, her heart heavier than the sack of bread she carried. She had knocked on many doors since her husband's death, each one turning her away with pity or suspicion. But this ranch, with its sprawling barns and endless cattle, was her last hope. Her hands trembled as she approached the porch, where silence sat like an unseen guard. She had rehearsed the words in her mind 100 times, hoping to keep her dignity intact though she came with nothing but need. When the rancher opened the door, his tall figure blocked out the light. His face was carved by years of labor and silence, sharp lines telling of responsibility more than joy. His eyes studied her, weighing her without cruelty yet without softness either. "I heard you might be needing someone in the kitchen," she said, her voice a careful blend of humility and courage. "I can cook, clean, whatever's needed. I only ask for a place to stay, and food for my son." The rancher's gaze dropped to the boy clinging to her skirt, wide-eyed and silent. For a long moment he said nothing, the weight of unspoken questions lingering between them. Finally, he stepped aside. "Come in." The air inside smelled of wood smoke and faintly of loneliness. The kitchen was large but cold, its shelves lined with jars, its counters untouched as though meals had been made hastily, without care. She set down her bread and began working, her movements steady, precise. The rancher said little, watching her test the old stove, knead dough, and stir a pot as though she had belonged there all along. Her son sat near the hearth, warmed for the first time in days. As night fell, a small figure appeared from the shadowed hallway, a girl, no more than 8, with eyes as solemn as her father's. She stood silently, staring at the widow with a mixture of shyness and yearning. The rancher's voice softened only slightly when he addressed her. "Emma, this is Mrs. Carter. She'll be helping us for a while." The girl didn't answer, only looked at the table where the smell of stew filled the room. During supper, silence lingered like an unwelcome guest, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The widow's son ate quickly, his hunger a quiet betrayal of their hardship, while Emma moved her spoon with the slow grace of a child too accustomed to being overlooked. Later, as the widow washed the dishes, she felt eyes on her. Emma stood close by, clutching a worn doll, her voice barely a whisper. "Can you tuck me in too?" The words pierced the stillness like a prayer. The rancher froze, his hand tightening on the back of a chair. The widow turned, meeting the child's pleading gaze, and in that instant she understood the silent hunger in this house wasn't for food but for tenderness. She dried her hands and followed Emma down the hallway. The girl's room was neat but lifeless, the bed made with crisp sheets but without warmth. The widow pulled back the quilt, smoothing it gently as Emma climbed in. She tucked the blanket around her small frame, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The girl clutched her doll, her lips trembling with the kind of need that words rarely reveal. "Good night," the widow whispered, her voice carrying the weight of every lullaby she had once sung to her own child before grief had silenced her songs. Emma's eyes closed, her breath easing into sleep as though she had been waiting for that moment of safety all her life. When the widow stepped out, she found the rancher in the hallway, his expression unreadable yet not untouched. For a man who commanded land, men, and beasts, his silence carried something deeper tonight, a vulnerability he could not mask. He looked at her, not as a stranger seeking charity, but as someone who had touched a part of his life he had long kept hidden. The days that followed wove threads between them all, delicate yet undeniable. The widow's hands filled the kitchen with warmth, her meals drawing life back into the home. Her son found laughter in the open fields, his small boots chasing shadows across the barnyard. And each night, Emma's quiet request remained the same, her small voice carrying more than any words her father could bring himself to say. The widow never refused. Each time she tucked the girl in, smoothing the quilt with tenderness, she felt something within herself mending as well. The rancher would linger in the hallway, silent witness to a bond forming in the place where grief and solitude had once built walls. Slowly, the silence in the house changed. It no longer pressed down like loneliness but spread like a blanket of peace. The widow began to see not just the stern lines of the rancher's face but the flicker of a man who had once known how to love and had buried it beneath duty and sorrow. He began to speak more. Small questions, quiet thanks, and each word felt like a stone lifted from his chest. And always, when the day ended and the sky turned its deep velvet hue, Emma's voice would call softly through the dusk, a plea and a gift entwined. Can she tuck me in too? The widow never turned away, and with each night, she came to understand that what had begun as necessity was shaping into something deeper, something that tethered not only her and her son to this place but also brought life back into a house that had been waiting, silently, for someone to return its warmth. The land stretched out like an ocean of dust and silence, the horizon bending beneath the weight of the setting sun. A young widow walked its edge, her steps measured, though the ache in her body begged her to stop. She carried nothing but a sack with half a loaf of bread, her son's small hand gripping her skirt as though his life depended on it. His shoes had holes at the toes, his hair needed trimming, and yet his eyes remained wide and hopeful, trusting her more than she trusted herself. It had been 6 months since her husband's death, 6 months of scraping through days with dignity fraying like threadbare cloth. Neighbors had offered pity but little else. The town had whispered of opportunities, of the wealthy rancher who owned land as far as sight could travel, but the young widow knew men like him rarely gave more than orders. Still, desperation was a cruel master, and so her path ended at his iron gates, where the dust clung to her shoes and her son's breathing slowed in fear. The ranch itself was an empire of sweat and discipline. Barns rose against the fading light, fences stitched the earth in perfect order, and cattle moved like shadows across the fields. It was a place ruled by strength, not tenderness. When the door opened, and the rancher himself appeared, the young widow knew she stood before a man carved by the very land he commanded. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that missed nothing. Lines marked his face like scars of years spent fighting storms, debts, and grief. He did not ask her name at once, nor smile to ease her nerves. Instead, he looked down at the boy clutching her skirt, then back at her, as though measuring what she sought against what he could give. "I heard you might need someone in the kitchen," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor inside. "I can cook, clean, whatever you need done. All I ask is a place to stay. Food for my son." The rancher didn't move for a long moment. The silence between them stretched, until her chest tightened, until she thought he would turn her away like the rest. But then he stepped aside, his voice low, practical. "Come in." Inside, the house was large but hollow. Wooden floors echoed with the absence of laughter, and the air carried the faint scent of smoke and dust. The kitchen was wide, its shelves lined with jars, its stove untouched long enough that rust had kissed its edges. It was not the home of a man who sat at tables or lingered over meals. It was the home of someone who worked until exhaustion and ate only to keep going. The widow set down her bread and moved with a confidence that came not from certainty but from survival. She stoked the stove, tested the cupboards, and began preparing a simple stew. The rancher said little, standing near the doorway, his arms folded as though unsure whether to send her away or thank her. Her son curled near the hearth, finally warmed, his small face softened by firelight. When the pot began to simmer, footsteps approached from the hallway. A girl appeared, slight, no more than 8 years old. She had her father's solemn eyes but not his guarded strength. She lingered near the doorway, clutching a doll so worn it had lost half its stuffing. Her gaze drifted not to the stranger at the stove but to the food, and then to her father, waiting for some permission unspoken. "This is Emma," the rancher said, his voice gentler with her. "Emma, this is Mrs. Carter. She'll be helping us for a while." The girl nodded but said nothing. They ate together in silence, broken only by the scrape of spoons against bowls. The widow's son devoured his portion quickly, his hunger raw. Emma ate slowly, almost carefully, as though she had grown used to meals without warmth, meals taken without company. Afterward, when the widow washed dishes, she felt eyes on her. Emma stood quietly, doll in hand, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Can you tuck me in too?" The words stilled the air. The rancher's back stiffened at the table, though he did not turn. The widow dried her hands, her heart tugging in a way she hadn't expected. She followed the girl down the hall to a room neat but lifeless. The bed was made with crisp sheets but no softness. Emma climbed in, clutching her doll. The widow pulled the quilt up to her chin, smoothing it gently, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. Emma's eyes fluttered closed, her breathing steadying as though this small act had mended something frayed within her. The widow whispered, "Good night, Emma," her voice carrying a tenderness she thought she had lost with her husband. When she turned, the rancher was standing in the hallway, watching. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes had shifted. Not softened, not yet, but something. Days turned into weeks. The widow worked in the kitchen from dawn to dusk, her meals transforming the house. The smell of bread, of stews and roasted meat, began to chase away the silence that had long reigned there. Her son found freedom in the wide fields, chasing barn cats, learning the rhythm of the land. And Emma began to bloom in small, quiet ways. She lingered in the kitchen while the widow cooked, asking shy questions. She shared her doll with the widow's son, and every night, she whispered the same request, always with hope trembling in her voice. "Can you tuck me in too?" The widow never refused. Each time, she tucked the child beneath her quilt, her heart mending in rhythm with Emma's trust. She began to see how loneliness had starved this house of tenderness, how the rancher's silence had been both shield and prison. He spoke little, but his presence changed. He lingered in the kitchen longer. He stood in the doorway while she read softly to Emma. Sometimes, she caught him, watching not with suspicion but with something deeper, something he himself did not seem ready to name. One night, as she tucked Emma in, the girl whispered, "You smell like cookies." "Mama used to smell like that too." The widow's chest tightened, but she only smiled, kissing the girl's forehead. "Sleep now, little one." When she left the room, she found the rancher waiting in the hallway again. His face was turned toward the shadows, but his voice carried a quiet ache. "She hasn't asked anyone for that, since her mother died." The widow met his gaze, her own grief reflected in his. She did not speak, for some wounds were too deep for words. But in that silence, something shifted, a fragile thread of connection, born not of necessity but of shared loss, binding two lives that had both known too much sorrow. And in the days that followed, as the sun rose and set over the vast ranch, the widow came to understand that what had begun as survival was turning into something more. A home was being stitched together, piece by fragile piece, in the softest of ways, through meals shared, through laughter rediscovered, and through a little girl's nightly plea that carried the weight of healing for them all. "Can you tuck me in too?"
The seasons on the ranch moved with an unhurried rhythm, each day marked by sunrises that bled gold over the fields and nights that ended with the same soft whisper from Emma, "Can you tuck me in too?" What had once been a simple request became the heartbeat of the household, a ritual that bound them all in quiet closeness. But life on a ranch, no matter how wealthy, carried hardships that could not be softened by stew and lullabies. The young widow soon learned that the rancher, William, carried debts of his own, debts of labor, of pride, and of promises made to a land that demanded endless work. Hired hands respected him, yet kept their distance, for his word was law. But they also noticed the change that had crept into the house since the widow's arrival. They saw light in the windows at night, smelled food that reminded them of homes long gone. Whispers began to stir, carrying her name not with cruelty, but with curiosity. The widow herself walked carefully, always aware of her place. She cooked, cleaned, and mended, but never overstepped. Yet she could not stop the way Emma sought her company at every turn, nor the way William's eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. She had buried her husband with her heart in pieces, and she had not come here to find anything beyond survival. Still, the threads of life wove themselves without her permission, binding her more tightly to this house with each passing day. One morning, as she kneaded dough, Emma skipped into the kitchen, her braids loose, her cheeks flushed with laughter. "Papa said I can ride with him today," she announced proudly. The widow smiled, dusting flour from her hands. "That sounds wonderful," she said. "Be sure to hold tight." Emma nodded solemnly, then added in a whisper only the widow could hear, "Will you wait for me? So you can still tuck me in." The widow's heart squeezed, and she knelt to smooth Emma's hair. "I'll always wait." The words slipped out before she could stop them, carrying a promise she hadn't intended to give, yet couldn't take back. That evening, when Emma returned safe, her cheeks glowing from the ride, William watched the two of them together. Something unspoken passed between his eyes and hers, something fragile and dangerous. Later, as the widow set bread on the table, he spoke low, almost as if to himself. "She's smiling again. I'd forgotten what that looked like." The widow's hand stilled on the loaf, but she said nothing. She knew that grief had silenced Emma for years, just as it had silenced her after losing her husband. To see joy return was to taste healing, but healing always came with the risk of opening one's heart again. Weeks turned into months, and the bond grew stronger. Emma clung to the widow as though she had always been there, as though her presence filled a space her mother had once held. The widow's son, too, found in William a figure he had longed for, someone who taught him to mend fences, to saddle a horse, to stand tall when the wind cut sharp. The house was no longer hollow. It echoed with voices, with laughter, with life. And yet, shadows remained. One afternoon, a neighbor's wife came to call, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "It's kind of William to take you in," she said, eyes scanning the widow's plain dress, the flour dusting her apron. "But people are beginning to talk. You know how tongues wag when a young woman takes a place in a man's home." The widow felt the sting of the words, though she held her chin high. She had asked for nothing but work and food for her child. Yet whispers could turn kindness into scandal faster than any storm. That night, as she tucked Emma in, the girl clutched her doll tighter and whispered, "Don't leave. Please don't leave." The widow brushed a tear from the child's cheek. "I'm not leaving, Emma. Not unless your papa sends me away." And when she turned from the bed, she found William in the doorway again, his eyes dark with thought. He had heard. In the days that followed, his distance grew. He still lingered, still watched, but with a heaviness in his gaze. The widow felt it too, a pull between them both, made heavier by fear. They had both buried love once. To reach for it again was to risk breaking all over. But fate rarely waits for hearts to be ready. One stormy night, the ranch was threatened by flooding. Rain hammered the earth, lightning split the sky, and the creek that wound through the land swelled with fury. William led his men out to the fields, shouting orders through the roar of the storm. The widow stayed inside, holding the children close, praying with each flash of lightning that the land would hold. Hours passed. The storm eased. At last, William returned, soaked and mud-streaked but alive. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion, but his eyes went first to Emma, safe and sleeping, then to the widow, who stood by the fire with her son in her arms. Something in him broke then, perhaps the last wall he had built to keep grief from consuming him. "You shouldn't have to carry this alone," he said quietly, his voice raw. "This house, this ranch, this girl, it's too much for one man." The widow met his gaze, her own tears unguarded. "And yet you've carried it." His eyes softened, weary but steady. "Not anymore." In that moment, she understood. It wasn't pity that had opened his door months ago, nor convenience that kept her there. It was something deeper, something neither of them had dared to name. From then on, their lives shifted, not with sudden declarations, but with steady, certain steps. William began to share more stories of his late wife, of the years he had struggled to keep the ranch and raise Emma alone. The widow, in turn, Spoke of her husband, of the fear that had gripped her when death left her with a child to protect and nothing to give him. In each other's grief, they found understanding. In each other's silence, they found peace. The town continued to whisper, but whispers lost their power in the face of what grew within the house. William's men respected her, seeing how the ranch thrived under her care. Emma blossomed, her laughter ringing clear across the fields, her nightly request now spoken with joy rather than fear. Can you tuck me in too? One evening, after a long day, the widow tucked Emma in and lingered at her bedside. Emma smiled sleepily. You feel like Mama, she whispered. The widow kissed her forehead, tears stinging her eyes. Sleep well, my sweet girl. When she stepped into the hallway, William was waiting. For once, he did not hide the look in his eyes, did not mask the tenderness that had grown too strong to ignore. He reached for her hand, calloused and steady. Stay, he said simply. Not as my cook, not as a guest. Stay as the woman who has given this house its life again. Her breath caught, but her heart answered before her lips could. She had come seeking survival. What she found was home. That night, as the stars burned above the vast ranch, the house no longer felt hollow. It was filled with laughter, with warmth, with a promise of a future built not on pity or need, but on love rediscovered. And when Emma whispered from her bed, "Can you tuck me in too?" the widow smiled through her tears, knowing this time the words carried more than a child's longing. They carried the seal of a family, stitched together by loss, healed by love, and bound by a promise that would endure beyond every storm.